Okay, we talked briefly in the last video about the Equal Protection Clause. I got through that entire video without Lainey and her ball. That streak is over. So, you haven't seen your mascot for a while. There she is. Okay, so we talked about equal protection. It's classification based, right? So the point is not supposed to be treating people differently because of who they are. Now, here's another way of putting that, and this is important. If I had a bar exam question on equal protection, I would write this 100 times out of 100. The general principle underlying equal protection is that the government should treat similarly situated people alike. Okay, if I'm in the same situation you are, if there's no discernible difference, relevant difference between my situation and your situation, if the only difference between my situation and your situation is, let's say, our ethnicity, right? Otherwise, there's no difference between my situation and your situation. And for some reason, the government is treating you differently than it's treating me. See how this works? This gives rise to an inference. Well, let's see. Person A and person B are in all relevant respects exactly the same, except for their ethnicity. And yet, the government is not treating them the same way. This certainly rings relevant in today's news cycle, to say the least. Then the question arises, and when I mentioned an inference, if the government is treating two people in the same situation differently, and there doesn't seem to be any difference that's relevant, that gives rise to an inference that there is something amiss. That the reason for the disparate treatment, the reason for treating one person one way and the other person another way, is likely, if there's no good reason for it, these are, again, the vocabulary of the law, if there's no good reason, if there's no valid reason for it because they are similarly situated, then we're left to conclude that whatever reason the government has is arbitrary. Arbitrary. We've talked about this before. Underlying much of due process and equal protection litigation law is the idea that the government should not treat people in an arbitrary way, badly in an arbitrary way. Now, having said that, so let me repeat that again. Similarly situated persons should be treated the same way by the government. So an equal protection violation fundamentally involves treating similarly situated people differently. Okay, if that's what you're doing, we want an explanation as to why. Now, there's much more to it. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of how to go through an equal protection analysis, let me say that we usually have to grapple with this in con law too whenever we introduce a new topic, is whether you deal with this new principle as an absolute. It cannot be that the government can never treat one person differently than another person, because the government does that all the time. Some people are in prison, some people aren't. Obviously, if the government throws you in prison, it's treating you differently than other people. If it charges you with a crime, it's treating you differently than other people. If a police officer pulls me over for speeding on the Solomon Expressway, can I roll down the window and say, look, I'm sorry, but you don't seem to understand the Equal Protection Clause. Equal Protection Clause clearly applies to you because you're a police officer, you work for a subdivision of a state or the state itself. And so you're not allowed to treat me differently than you treat everybody else. You can't treat me differently because I was driving 90 miles an hour than the person who's driving 70 miles an hour. That's a differential treatment, and it's banned under the Equal Protection Clause. I hope that illustration, although it seems silly and mundane, makes the point. Different people pay different tax rates. Different people are treated differently based on the speed they drive. Different people are treated differently based on whether they engage in criminal conduct. So differential treatment is common. So the Equal Protection Clause is not a requirement that all persons be treated the same as all other persons. Let me repeat. What it is a promise that similarly situated persons would be treated alike. So if one person, and this, look, talk about traffic stops, okay? So if people of one ethnic heritage are treated one way when they're driving 90 miles an hour, and people of another ethnic heritage are treated another way when they're driving at 90 miles an hour, now we have a problem because they're similarly situated. If you're pulling over everybody who's driving 90 miles an hour, we don't have an equal protection problem. It doesn't look like that's arbitrary. I keep coming back to that word. If, on the other hand, some people who drive 90 are fine and some people who drive 90 aren't, now we're looking for some arbitrary reason why you would do that. Why would you treat one group differently than another group when they're similarly situated? So let me repeat. The Equal Protection Clause is not a promise that every person under the government's jurisdiction will be treated like every other person. The Equal Protection Clause is a promise that similarly situated persons should be treated the same way by the government. So that leads us into a discussion that we will take up in other venues. But under what circumstances would a court conclude that the basis for treating one group of people differently than another group is arbitrary? The Equal Protection Clause is not a command that the government treat us all the same way. So when would a court find that there's some problem with the way people are being treated? That, as you will see, and as you already know from your reading, that has a lot to do with what group the government is targeting. Although the Equal Protection Clause says that no state may deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Notice that word person in the singular. Right, so it guarantees to every person within the jurisdiction of the state the equal protection of the laws. Courts have said, yeah, it says person, but it really kind of means group or classification. Because, and that makes some sense, right? Because the Equal Protection Clause is meant to stop discrimination, and it is meant to stop arbitrary treatment of a person. And the arbitrary treatment of a person is much more likely to be not about a characteristic of that person alone, but rather the basis for discrimination is usually a person's membership in some group of persons that is disfavored by the state. Unfortunately, we have a long history of that being the case. So we're going to spend the next few weeks here talking about different groups of people: ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, alienage, right, classifications like that, where how do courts treat disparate treatment based on those classifications. So when the government targets somebody based on one of those classifications, what happens? Now, it's not going to come as a surprise to you that there are some parallels between due process and equal protection in terms of the analytical models. If the government discriminates against a non-suspect class, a class like the court, for example, has said age is not a suspect classification. There's all kinds of good reasons to treat people differently based on their age, so we're not going to say that's a suspect class. Don't worry about this terminology. We'll get through it, but I just want to introduce it. So if the government discriminates against a non-suspect class, kind of like a low-level right, you get rational basis review. If the government's discriminating against something like ethnicity, which the court says is absolutely a suspect classification, then that's a lot like taking away somebody's fundamental rights and you get strict scrutiny. So that's where we're headed, but it was important to get some general principles on the table before we get started looking at cases and applying the rules. So stay tuned for more, and as always, stay safe out there.